In Saramago's universe, in Death with Interruptions, even death succumbs to love. Death is a she, by the way. She decides that, first of all she decides, perhaps I should just stop it, we won't have any more death, so no one dies, which has terrible consequences, you can imagine. There's not room for everyone who didn't die. And then she decides, no, I'll send a little note to people telling them that you're going to die on a certain day. That doesn't go down well either. But she sends one note to a cellist, and for some reason he doesn't get it, and so he doesn't die on the day he's supposed to die. And so she has to go and investigate to find out why he hasn't died. And she goes to his apartment, the apartment he shares with his dog. Saramago loves dogs, by the way. And this is the first experience that death has had of domesticity. She watches the cellist sleeping. The man changed position, turned his back on the wardrobe, blocking the door, and let his right arm slide down towards the side on which the dog is lying. A minute later, he was awake. He was thirsty. He turned on his bedside light, got up, shuffled his feet into the slippers, which were, as always, providing a pillow for the dog's head, and went into the kitchen. Death followed him. The man filled a glass with water and drank it. At this point the dog appeared, slaked his thirst in the water dish next to the back door, and then looked up at his master. I suppose you want to go out, said the bird cellist. He opened the door and waited until the animal came back. A little water remained in his glass. Death looked at it, and made an effort to imagine what it must be like to feel thirsty, but failed. She would have been equally incapable of imagining it when she'd had to make people die of thirst in the desert, but at the time she hadn't even tried. The dog returned, wagging his tail. Let's go back to sleep, said the man. They went into the bedroom again. The dog turned round twice, then curled up into a ball. The man drew the sheet up to his neck, coughed twice, and soon afterwards was asleep again. Sitting in her corner, Death was watching. Much later, the dog got up from the carpet and jumped onto the sofa. For the first time in her life, Death knew what it felt like to have a dog on her lap. I just love that. It's a wonderful humanization of death. They're often really horrible. There's a king, as I mentioned, in Balthazar and Blimunda, who is just obsessed with building his palace. Bureaucrats and politicians in Death with Interruptions who always make the wrong decisions and just make endless pompous speeches. I was watching Fox News before I came out, and it reminded me of that. And in God and the Devil, in the Gospel according to Jesus Christ, God and the devil are always bickering about who's right. And in the last book, Saramago, he was in his 80s, and he nearly died of pneumonia, a terrible bout of pneumonia, and he nearly died from that. He recovered from that. He wrote The Elephant's Journey, which is, I can recommend to everyone, it's a wonderful book. And then he died a few years later, but he managed to write another book called Cain, which is really, I think, an atheist's last kick at God. It's about Cain, and Cain is, he's murdered Abel, his brother, but he's been tricked into murdering Abel by God, who should have known better. And then Cain wanders off into various sort of other Old Testament stories. I mean, in a way, sort of the Old Testament God is quite an easy target, I think. But it's a very witty and funny book. And God is really seen as more of a kind of improviser than a creator. And I'll just read the first bit. When he creates Adam and Eve, God realizes that he has left something out. When the Lord, also known as God, realized that Adam and Eve, although perfect in every outward aspect, could not utter a word or make even the most primitive of sounds, he must have felt annoyed with himself, for there was no one else in the Garden of Eden whom he could blame for this grave oversight. After all, the other animals, who were, like the two humans, the product of his divine command, already had a voice of their own, be it a bellow, a roar, a croak, a chirp, a whistle, or a cackle. In an access of rage, surprising in someone who could have solved any problem simply by issuing another quick fiat, he rushed over to Adam and Eve and unceremoniously, in no half measures, stuck his tongue down the throats of first one and then the other. From the texts which, over the centuries, have provided a somewhat random record of these remote times, be it of events that might at some future date be awarded canonical status, and others deemed to be the fruit of apocryphal and irredeemably heretical imaginations, it is not at all clear what kind of tongue was being referred to here. Whether the moist, flexible muscle that moves around in the buccal cavity, and occasionally outside it too, or the gift of speech, also known as language, that the Lord has so regrettably forgotten to give them, and about which we know nothing. This is not a trace of its remains, not even a heart engraved on the bark of a tree, accompanied by some sentimental message, something along the lines of, "I love Eve." It's likely that the Lord's violent assault on his offspring's silent tongues had another motive, namely, given that in principle you can't have one without the other, that of putting them in contact with the deepest depths of their physical being, the so-called perturbations of the inner self, so that in future they could, with some authority, speak of those dark and labyrinthine disquiets, out of whose window the mouth, their tongues were already appearing. Well, anything is possible. With the praiseworthy scrupulousness of any skilled craftsman, making up with due humility for his earlier negligence, the Lord wanted to make sure that his mistake had been corrected, and so he asked Adam, "What's your name?" And the man replied, "I'm Adam, your firstborn." Then the Creator turned to the woman, "And what is your name?" "I'm Eve, the first lady," she replied, rather unnecessarily, since there was no other. The Lord was satisfied, and bade farewell with a fatherly, "See you later then," and went about his business. I just think that's an extraordinary piece of writing for a man in his 80s about to die. It's so full of life and wit and verve. And he died, Saramago died 2 years ago, and an early novel of his, which was never published, one of those early novels I'd mentioned, it has just been published in Portugal after his death. He didn't want it to be published during his lifetime. I think because it's completely unlike his other novels. What we think of as a Saramago novel, it's perfectly orthodox in its punctuation. It's still about ordinary people. It still has his major themes in it. And I will be translating that into English next year. That will be the last Saramago novel I'll translate. And I feel that, it's been an enormous privilege to be allowed to translate his novels. And I was talking to Olivia yesterday, and she was saying, is there another Saramago novel? And that will be the last. And I really don't think there'll be another writer like Saramago. So read him while you can. Thank you very much.